Hello, my name is Johnny Kinsman. Thank you for letting me spend some time with you today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the Battle of Bunker Hill. I am a peaceful man, and I am no fan of war, so I do find it a bit odd that this has become one of my favorite subjects. But the thing that fascinates me about the Battle of Bunker Hill is that it was never really supposed to happen. The personalities of the people involved, the bravery that they exhibited, the horrible decisions that they made at some turns made the Battle of Bunker Hill an inevitability, and therefore the entire American Revolution became an inevitability. Now, this is typically a live talk, but in the strange days in which we're living, it's become a video shoot. But I think the story holds up, so away we go. By way of context, to understand the battle and the events leading up to the battle, it's important to go all the way back to 1630. Seems like a far leap to go for a battle that took place in 1775, but bear with me. Before Boston was called Boston, it was called Shawmut by the natives who inhabited the area and who fished on the peninsula. Now, Shawmut Peninsula had a very narrow strip of land connecting it to a body of land that sometimes was an island. Shawmut means living water. There was a huge basin of the Charles River on one side, the rising and falling tides of the Atlantic Ocean on the other side, and in the middle of the peninsula, this naturally bubbling spring water. So John Winthrop and his Puritans found Shawmut in 1630, decided to settle there, promptly renamed it Boston to pay tribute to their old home of Boston, England. England was thrilled to get rid of the Puritans. They had very rigid ideas about religion, and they wanted the freedom to practice the religion in their brand without the interference of the Anglican Church. So the king let them go. They promised to still remain British and to keep sending money back to the mother country in exchange for their religious freedom. If you fast forward 100 years, the Puritans have done all of this work, farming the land, building the port cities, establishing treaties and trade deals with natives, and over time, other people besides Puritans begin to call Boston home. Meanwhile, France and England have been locked in a global war. This old conflict falls upon the new continent that everybody's fighting for, and it becomes a long, protracted war called the French and Indian War. This cost a lot of money, this war, and so in the ultimately successful British campaign to retain control of the continent, they found their war coffers empty. This began a very deep ideological rift between New England and Old England. The way the king and the parliament saw it, the colonies should be grateful for the protection of the navy and the protection of the British army who came to defend their homes, and so therefore it is time to pay some taxes. The way the colonists saw it, they built this place with their bare hands. They cleared the forests. They established the ports. They established the trade. They had been giving money to England for a century. And not only that, they fought right alongside the British Redcoats in the French and Indian War to protect their own homes. So what more can you give besides your blood and your sweat and your tears? The debt was square. 1765. The royal governor of Massachusetts is a guy named Thomas Hutchinson. He's wildly unpopular. He's very rich. He's very vain. He's unable to connect with the people he is supposed to be governing. And he has the sad job of trying to enforce the Stamp Act, wherein every piece of paper, from a playing card to a mortgage to a land deed to a broadsheet, had to have a royal stamp showing that you had paid the tax on that piece of paper. Well, the Stamp Act resulted in such intense rioting that a mob formed in Boston and absolutely tore Thomas Hutchinson's mansion apart. Brick by brick, shingle by shingle, they tore the moldings off the walls, they took everything of value, it was trashed. He was removed as governor. And after a very tumultuous few years, General Thomas Gage was given the honor of becoming the military governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. When I say this was an honor, I'm being sarcastic. Poor Thomas Gage fell into this job quite by mistake. He was a man of high society. He was enjoying being the general of every British troop of the King of England that inhabited the continent of North America. And he was married to a beautiful American woman named Margaret Kemble. And they had friends, and they had money, and they had esteem, and they were known throughout their high circles of society for their conjugal felicity. Anyway, one day, General Gage says to King George III, yes, about the problems in Boston. I think a true show of military force would have these rebels lying down in the streets like dogs. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the point. And King George goes, oh, that's wonderful. You're hired. And Gage is like, what? So next thing you know, Gage is installed in Boston as the governor of Massachusetts, and he's also still in charge of every single British troop on the entire continent. General Thomas Gage inherited a complete mess of a situation. For instance, in 1770, a lone British sentry is standing guard outside the townhouse. It's a freezing cold night. It's March. And he is just trying to get through the night, and a kid comes up to him. A local starts making fun of him. He tells the kid to get lost. The kid doesn't go home. He goes right into the tavern where his older brother has been for hours. He says, oh, the soldier was mean to me. Everybody in the bar, what? They all go out, they surround this one soldier. Luckily, by then, backup has arrived, but there are like 9 British soldiers, and they are completely surrounded by this huge mob of locals who start throwing things at them like rocks and firewood, and some of them are armed with cutlasses, which are these sturdy naval swords, and they start antagonizing the soldiers, and they are daring them to fire. The soldiers get confused, they think they hear the order, they lower their guns, they fire into the crowd, 5 people die. The British Army calls this the incident on King Street. But the propaganda machine in Boston, funded by John Hancock and fueled by Sam Adams, renamed this event the Boston Massacre. 1773, England has this gigantic store of tea that is about to go bad. They need to move this product. It's the East India Tea Company. King George III is an investor in the East India Tea Company. They can't have this thing, get eaten by bugs. And so they say, oh, great, let's sell it to the colonies. It'll be an exclusive deal to the colonies, deep discount. But while we're at it, we'll put this little tiny tax. And we'll raise some money. But they're still getting such a great deal with this tea. They'll love it. Well, John Hancock, known smuggler and financier of the rebellion, Sam Adams, agitator of the rabble, they combine forces to make this into a political opportunity where instead of unloading the tea and paying the taxes, they have about 150 men and boys disguised as natives storm Boston Harbor and board these 3 boats, the Beaver, the Eleanor, the Dartmouth. They grab the tea, they throw it overboard. The Boston Tea Party. King George freaks out. Complete overreaction. The result of the overreaction is the Coercive Acts. It's renamed by New Englanders the Intolerable Acts. And among these acts are the following decrees. The port of Boston is closed. It's a shipping town. This tanks the entire economy and makes people very angry. Also, everyday citizens are now forced to house British officers in their homes, feed them, clothe them, keep them warm, whether they want to or not. Not a great move. But the biggest blunder that England made after the Boston Tea Party was to disband all local government and to try to replace all of our elected officials with royally appointed officials called mandamus councillors. Not only were the mandamus councillors immediately rejected through violence and threats of further violence, they all quit their jobs and moved to Boston to be protected by the loyalists there. But when a citizenry has a gripe with their leaders, it is natural to want to voice that gripe. By disbanding local government and not allowing any public gatherings, you take away the voice of the people to have a reasonable conversation. And all of that animus moves into the shadows, into the back rooms of bars, into secret meetings, and in the end, it became very dangerous for the king and the crown and the parliament. 1774 is when Thomas Gage inherits this entire mess, and his first job is to try to enforce these coercive acts. Immediately, General Gage starts to see that he's got a much larger problem on his hands than he realized when he was bragging to the King of England that he could take care of it. And he also realized that if he was going to squash any sort of a rebellion, he did not have the resources necessary to do so. He asks the king and the parliament for more help. Here's a wonderful quote by him. "If you think 10,000 men sufficient, send 20. If 1,000,000 in pounds sterling is thought enough, give 2. You will save both blood and treasure in the end. A large force will terrify and engage many to join you. A middling one will encourage resistance and gain no friends." Well, the king and the parliament are not at all interested in granting General Gage more resources, so they basically send back a message saying, do the job with what you have, or else you'll be removed in disgrace. General Gage comes up with a great plan. There have been muskets and cannon stolen from the British Army in Boston and secreted out of the city, and everybody knows that it is the rebel force that is trying to stockpile enough arms to create an army, possibly for a revolution. Gage also knows where they are hiding the weapons. It's in Concord, Massachusetts. And so, being a guy who does not want to incite a riot, he comes up with a great plan to send about 700 British redcoats out in the middle of the night to the town of Concord, secretly march there at daybreak, steal all the weapons back, march back to Boston victorious, and report to the king and the parliament that he has taken all the weapons from the revolution and there's nothing to worry about. I'm going to pause that story because there's a very important figure that I must introduce to you, and his name is Joseph Warren. For the purposes of this entire story, you can think of General Thomas Gage and Dr. Joseph Warren as equals. Gage did not see it that way, but in your mind's eye, consider these two as in charge of both sides. Joseph Warren started off with a hard luck tale. He had a normal upbringing, his family owned an orchard, things were great. His father, picking apples, falls out of a tree, breaks his neck and dies. It's a horrible tragedy. The family was so well esteemed in their community that people pool money together to send young Joseph Warren to Harvard. At Harvard, he enjoys great success and a lot of popularity. Kind of a swashbuckling tale is friends of his, one time they were having a secret meeting. They didn't want Joseph there for whatever reason. He's knocking on the door. They're saying, no, 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 you can't come in, you can't come in. He wants in. So he goes outside the building and he sizes it up and he looks, oh, if I do this and this and this and this. Next thing you know, Joseph Warren has climbed up to a drain pipe and is shimmying across to the drain pipe and kicking into the window. And he smashes his feet right in and lands in the room. Everybody is shocked. And the drain pipe that he used to do this smashes to the ground and breaks into a million pieces behind him. And without breaking his glare at his friends, he said, well, it served its purpose. Pretty brave for a kid whose father just died from falling out of a tree. Anyway, I digress. Joseph Warren learned medicine at Harvard and immediately became a young doctor under the tutelage of older doctors. And this was at a terrible time in Boston's history where there was a smallpox epidemic going on. People were dying left and right. Everybody was scared to treat them. Joseph Warren not only was brave enough to go in and treat these people, but also heal them, inoculate them, and little by little his reputation grew, not only for his bedside manner, but his ability to relate to people, rich and poor, young and old. The fact that he stuck around in the middle of this tumultuous time and did the job to help people made him become seen as a man of the people. And some of his political leanings were not satisfactory to the King of England and the Parliament. By the time General Gage hatches this plan to send all of these troops to Concord in the middle of the night, Dr. Joseph Warren has become the leader of the spy network in Boston. Hancock and Adams, yes, they're still involved with what they're trying to stoke as a revolution, but Joseph Warren is the boots-on-the-ground leader of all the goings-on in Boston. And so Joseph Warren found out about the British plan to march to Concord before the foot soldiers found out about the British plan to march to Concord. Joseph Warren is the guy that dispatched Paul Revere one way and William Dawes the other way to ride in the middle of the night and spread what they called the Middlesex Alarm to get everybody up in arms to meet the British Army in Lexington. Now, the Brits were going to Concord, but Joseph Warren, his intel was sound, but not complete. And what he feared is that the British Redcoats were marching to Lexington to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams because of their role in the Boston Tea Party. At daybreak, the British column marches into Lexington Green. There's an armed militia waiting on the green. Somebody shoots at somebody. Nobody knows who shot first, but it became known as the shot heard round the world. A few hours later, in the neighboring town of Concord, there's a standoff at the Old North Bridge. Well, I guess at that point it would have just been the North Bridge. It wasn't that old. Anyway, somebody shoots at somebody. British soldiers dead, dying. Colonists dead and dying. The soldiers have no cannons. They have no Hancock. They have no Adams. They have no clue what they're doing out there, but they do know that they have to get all the way back to Boston. And they march and they march and they march and they march all the way back, taking heavy, heavy gunfire the entire way. This road is a thing you can tour now. It is called Battle Road, and you can see some of the sites where all of this horrible violence took place. Since the moment Paul Revere and William Dawes began waking people up in the middle of the night, they started gathering toward Lexington. They started gathering toward Concord. They followed the column all the way back to Boston and to Charlestown. From that moment, all the way up until the Battle of Bunker Hill, almost 2 months later, people kept pouring in and pouring in and pouring in from all over, not only from Massachusetts, but from neighboring states as well. And Boston was now under siege by its own colonists. So the reason I went all the way back to talk about Shawmut Peninsula and the geography of it is because it was so easy for the rabble following the British soldiers all the way back to Boston to set up a barricade at Boston Neck and surround the entire peninsula and begin a siege. This was humiliating for General Gage and for the Loyalists and for the army, who had just suffered a crazy defeat. They were supposed to go on a secret mission. What they ended up with was bloodshed and hurt pride. Right after Lexington and Concord, Warren sends a letter to Gage, addressing him as an equal. He's giving him his deference in terms of his titles and his place in, government and all of that. But he's saying, look, I know we can work together to solve these problems. You have an opinion. We have an opinion. Before more blood is shed, let's work it out. General Gage is having none of it. And General Gage sends a letter back. What Gage offers is amnesty for every single rebel in arms, except John Hancock and Sam Adams, because he knows that King George III just wants to see them hanging from some far-off British hill for their treason and their daring to create the Boston Tea Party. What Joseph Warren and the Patriot side send back to Gage is another letter offering to pardon every British soldier in Boston except General Thomas Gage and the Mandamus counselors who tried to take over government. Things are not going well. As Joseph Warren is writing this flowery letter, the first one, to Gage, trying to make up with him and work together, he's also penning a call to arms. And he says, I quote, "We conjure you, by all that is dear, by all that is sacred, that you give all assistance possible in forming an army. Our all is at stake." So this is how the 10,000 people end up showing up around Boston. And after Lexington and Concord, one of the officers, British officers involved in that conflict, is quoted as saying, "Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. Upon the alarm being given, they come from far and near, and the longer the action lasts, the greater their numbers grow." General Gage writes an official account of this, and he sends it in a ship back to London. But the propaganda machine being what it is in Boston, the Patriot side of things sent a faster ship that was not loaded down with goods, the Cuero. And the Cuero crossed the Atlantic Ocean so quickly that the Patriot side of this story reached London and all of the Parliament and the King and high society almost 2 weeks before General Gage's official account arrived. His name was Mud by that point. Meanwhile, as the Cuero is crossing the ocean, another ship is crossing the ocean. This ship is called the Cerberus. Now, when General Gage was asking for more soldiers, more money, what England sent to him instead was more generals. It was a direct insult to Gage's ability to manage the situation. And the Cerberus, if you know mythology at all, the Cerberus is the name of the three-headed dog that guards the gates to hell. The three generals that they sent over: William Howe, John Burgoyne, Henry Clinton. This was such a big deal that these three generals were going across the sea that there was a poem written about them. Poem might be a stretch. Behold the Cerberus, the Atlantic plow, its precious cargo, Burgoyne, Clinton, Howe. Bow, wow, wow. Complex, right? These guys, Burgoyne and Clinton and Howe. Let me just introduce them to you. General Clinton. There's a wonderful historian named Richard Ketchum. I'm going to read a quote of his describing Henry Clinton. Colorless, short, rather paunchy little man with a round face, a large nose, and a sensitivity to criticism that was almost a disease. Although he was an intelligent, reasonably competent soldier who might have gone far, his tendency to suspect everyone, to look behind every remark and gesture for an affront, made him mistrust even himself in the end. That's a very generous way of saying this guy was smart, but he was so annoying that nobody wanted to listen to him even when they knew he was right. So he's going to solve things for sure. Who's next? Oh, William Howe. So I'm going to quote another historian, Nathaniel Philbrick. William Howe was a handsome man, about 6 feet tall, with dark hair, black eyes, and a majestic reticence that did not prevent him from having a very good time when not on the battlefield. So William Howe, sure, he was a gambler. Sure, he was a bit of a drunk. Sure, he was a known rebel sympathizer, depending on the argument. So maybe not the best general to send over, right? But to be fair to William Howe, his valor in battle was never questioned. And his bravery exhibited at Bunker Hill, which I will get to, proves that he was a worthy soldier and a worthy general. So his personal reputation notwithstanding, he was pretty much the best of the lot on the Cerberus. Because the other guy is General John Burgoyne. This peacock of a man was a playwright, and the only thing John Burgoyne loved more than writing plays was himself. And in fact, as the Cerberus was entering, getting near Boston, they came upon a transport ship. They had been at sea for over a month. They had no idea that Lexington and Concord had even occurred. They were dispatched from London before word arrived. If you can imagine how slowly the communication is going. Anyway, the Cerberus sees a British ship. They saddle up next to each other, and they're speaking to each other through a little, like a talking horn. And what news? Oh, you wouldn't believe it. The Lexington and Concord happened. What? And so, from this transport ship, the Cerberus finds out that from the moment Paul Revere and William Dawes woke up one guy who woke up another guy and another guy, there are now 10,000 militia surrounding the entire peninsula of Boston, and there is a siege going on, and none of the troops there know what to do, and General Gage won't do anything, and the Loyalists are starting to think that they've backed the wrong horse, and it's a complete disaster. And Burgoyne, reportedly, without even putting his mouth to the little talkie horn, says, "What? 10,000 peasants keep 5,000 king's troops shut up? Well, let us get in and we'll soon find some elbow room." Oh, he's such a card. Everybody's laughing. The other ship is laughing. Oh, by the time the Cerberus even gets to Long Wharf in Boston, There are crowds gathering, people waving handkerchiefs, crying and repeating the joke, elbow room, elbow room. These three get off the Cerberus and they get into this gilded, like Cinderella's carriage, and they ride to go see General Gage. Can you imagine what Gage felt like at this point? Hello, gentlemen. Let me show you around. Burgoyne, Clinton, and Howe and Gage come up with a plan that they are going to strike at the heart of the rebel camp, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In fact, if you know Cambridge at all, there's Cambridge Green. It's right near what is today Harvard University. That is where the rebel command was set up. And everybody knew it. It was an open secret, but the siege was so effective, they knew it would cost a lot of soldiers to get out of Boston. So they had to make their mark and make it count. So they were planning to attack Cambridge on June 18th. Well, we had this wonderful spy network headed up by Dr. Joseph Warren. There were operatives all over the city, and we found out about the British plan. So they have to decide what to do. Are they going to try to defend Cambridge, or are they going to distract the British Army by fortifying Dorchester Heights on one side of the peninsula or Charlestown Heights on the other side of the peninsula? In the middle of this, General Gage's wife, Margaret Kemble, she's American. Her family is American. Yes, she married a British general. Of course she has loyalist leanings. But some of her own family have differing opinions. And she confesses in a letter to her friend that she is absolutely torn. In fact, she quotes a Shakespeare play, King John. And she writes in a letter to her friend, "The sun's o'ercast with blood, fair day, adieu. Which is the side that I must go withal? I am with both, each army hath a hand. Whoever wins on that side shall I lose, assured loss before the match is played." I think it's safe to say that by the time all of this is going on, the conjugal felicity is over. The Committee of Safety is the governing body that's organizing all of the patriot movements. Dr. Joseph Warren is a member of the Committee of Safety. What they decide to do is to fortify Bunker's Hill in Charlestown. It's nice and high. It's pretty far from the harbor and further still from the peninsula, but it is a wonderful strategic high ground because if they get cannons up there, then they can shoot at the ships in the harbor. And so they decide, okay, we're gonna leave the Cambridge News alone, and on the night of June 16th, we are going to send 1,000 men up with shovels and pickaxes and guns, and we're going to dig a fort. And so that's exactly what they do. One of the guys in charge of this operation, General Israel Putnam. His nickname was Old Put. This guy was a legend in his own time for his bravery and for his fiery temper and for his adventurous life. He served in the King's Army back in the French and Indian War. He was shipwrecked off of Cuba. As the ship was sinking, he started telling people, lash this piece together and that piece together. They started building rafts. They survived the shipwreck. They washed up on shore. They were afraid of cannibals. And so Israel Putnam organized the force that protected from the cannibal natives until another British ship arrived months later to find them and rescue them and take them home. When he was living in Connecticut, there were wolves everywhere, and the wolves loved to eat sheep, and it was bad for the farmers and all of that, so there was an open season killing wolves. Well, Israel Putnam found out there was one last wolf that hadn't been killed. And so, what does he do? He gets a couple of friends and he ties a rope around his own ankles and he wanders into the wolf den with a gun. And he shoots the wolf and calls his friends and they pull him out. And he's credited as killing the last she-wolf in Connecticut. Look, I like wolves. It's not a great story for wildlife, but it's a daring story of adventure. Who climbs into a cave and shoots a wolf in the den and all of that? They got him on their shoulders in a firelight ceremony. When he was in the Army, there was a fire in a barracks right next to the magazine where all of the powder and ammunition was stored, and an explosion was imminent. Everybody was running away. Israel Putnam ran toward the fire, and he started putting buckets and buckets of water on it, and because he started doing it, a bucket brigade was formed, and even though the fire was raging and raging and raging, he continued the bucket brigade, and he continued fighting the fire. The skin was falling off of his arms. He was so close and had such severe burns, but he put the fire out, and he recovered for months afterward. When the news of Lexington and Concord reached him in Connecticut, he was plowing a field. He heard the news, he left the plow in the field, mounted his horse, and drove an entire herd of sheep up to Cambridge, to the rebel headquarters, and presented himself to the person in charge, Artemus Ward, and said, "My name is Israel Putnam, I've brought you some sheep, I have this experience and that experience," and was a major general. Another guy leading these 1,000 soldiers up with shovels and pickaxes, Colonel William Prescott. He too had seen action in the French and Indian War. And because of the political upheaval in Boston, he started to lean much more toward the rebel side of things than the loyalist side of things, and he had a brother-in-law named Abijah Willard. And they would have these arguments. Abijah Willard says to him that his life and estate would be forfeited for treason if he took up arms against Britain. And Prescott says, "I've made up my mind on that subject. I think it probable I may be found in arms, but I will never be taken alive." So, Israel Putnam, William Prescott, and about 1,000 men are up in the heights of Charlestown digging on June 16th. They start at about midnight. And they're digging, and they're digging, and they're digging, and they're digging. Meanwhile in Boston, General Henry Clinton, the smart but annoying one, well, he can't sleep. What a surprise. And he's walking around the town trying to get some air, and he can hear digging across the harbor in Charlestown. So he goes and wakes up Thomas Gage, the general, and he says, "Look, the rebels are working the ground in Charlestown. I think we should investigate." And Thomas Gage decides to wait until dawn to investigate. So this gives them hours and hours and hours at the top of this hill. And they're digging and they're digging and they're digging and they're digging. And by the time the sun does rise, what these guys have created is a gigantic earthen fort with no roof, and it's called a redoubt. They're looking around, they're admiring the fort, they're seeing the sky brighten, they're looking at Boston, they look at the harbor, and they realize they have fortified the wrong hill. The Committee of Safety approved the fortification of Bunker's Hill, way inland. What these guys have done in the middle of the night is fortified Breed's Hill, which is lower, closer to Boston, and closer to the harbor. Historians argue still, was this an honest mistake because most of these guys weren't from around there and they got confused in the darkness and just started digging? Or did they change plans between leaving the headquarters in Cambridge and setting a shovel into the dirt in Charlestown? Knowing the personality of Israel Putnam and how anxious he was for a fight, I would put my money on the fact that he convinced everybody to dig into the different hill. Whatever the case is, a ship in the harbor starts firing cannonballs at them, the HMS Lively. All of a sudden, the guys in the fort hadn't really considered this. They were sent up there to dig, they were going to leave, and soldiers were going to come and fight. But all of a sudden, the HMS Lively is sending cannonballs, and they're starting to look around, and they're going, wait a minute, maybe we should get out of here. And all of the officers who are present are going, no, 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 don't you see? The cannon cannot reach us. They're trying to scare us. They're trying to do exactly what they're doing. They're making you question your decision. But hold your ground. This is a strategic move. We're going to be fine. And in the middle of all of this, a guy named Asa Pollard, who was sitting there working at the redoubt and making it stronger, has his head taken clean off by a cannonball. The people around him cannot believe it. They start panicking. They start looking for clergy. They want to have a proper funeral for this guy. And Colonel William Prescott sees that this is going on, and he marches right over to them and he says, get that body in the dirt before everybody else sees it too. And as they start obeying him, he jumps onto the top of the redoubt. It's called a parapet. And he starts swinging his sword around, and he's almost dancing around as the cannonballs are raining around him. At this point, General Gage has finally put a spyglass to his eye in Boston, and he looks across at the rebel works, and he sees this maniac dancing around and yelling, "Hit me if you can, hit me," daring the ships in the harbor to aim for him. Well, Gage doesn't recognize this guy, so he hands the spyglass to the man next to him. He says, "Do you know who this man is?" Guy takes up the spyglass. "It's my brother-in-law, William Prescott." The guy with the spyglass is Abijah Willard. These guys have argued for years, and now all of a sudden, here is Prescott taking up arms against the king's army. So Gage says to him, "Will he fight?" Abijah Willard is quoted as saying, "Yes, sir. He is an old soldier and will fight as long as a drop of blood remains in his veins." Awesome quote, right? But here's the thing. There's an equally awesome quote attributed to the same moment in time by a different author. So I'm going to do it again with the different quote too. Gage says, "Will he fight?" Abijah Willard says, "I cannot answer for his men, but Prescott will fight you to the gates of hell." Two awesome quotes. Two wildly different accounts of the same exact moment. How does this happen? Well, after knocking my head against the wall, trying to figure out how these two very, very credible historians had such differing accounts, I have discovered that, I get so excited, excuse me. I've discovered that he's an old soldier and will fight as long as a drop of blood remains in his veins. That was the account of Prescott's son. The thing about fighting you all the way to the gates of hell, that was Prescott's grandson. So clearly, over time in the Prescott family, this story has grown and grown in magnitude and in scope. Either way, Gage finds out in this moment that the guy on top of the parapet is not fooling around and they better get serious about engaging. At this point, Prescott finally decides to order reserve troops from Cambridge. I don't know why he waited so long. They should have been in there in the middle of the night. More and more ships are firing cannons at the redoubt, and Prescott says, "Okay, you, John Brooks, Major John Brooks, you, Brooks, go to the artillerymen, take one of their horses, ride to Cambridge, tell them we need more troops right away." Well, John Brooks goes to the artillerymen. They won't give him a horse. They refuse to give him a horse. So he takes off walking from Charlestown to Cambridge with urgency to get backup. It turns out that the reason the artillerymen would not give them a horse is because they were planning to desert the battlefield, which they did. And, as justice would have it, they were court-martialed later for their cowardice. But here's John Brooks walking all the way to Cambridge. He finally gets to Cambridge, and he has to ask for backup. And the guy he's asking, Artemus Ward. Wah, wah. Artemus Ward is a diligent soldier, but he is a slow and plodding and overly cautious thinker. In his defense, he was not expecting to hear that all of these 1,000 guys dug into the hill that was going to guarantee a fight. He thought they were going to dig into Bunker's Hill, the safe one. Instead, they dug into Breed's Hill, which was too enticing a target for Gage not to strike. And Artemus Ward is saying, well, but what if they actually decide to fortify Dorchester? What if this whole Cambridge thing was just a ruse? What if they actually are going to strike Cambridge? I don't feel comfortable giving you the soldiers. As Artemus Ward is waffling about whether he's going to send troops or whether he's not going to send troops, a guy named Richard Devens decides that they will send all New Hampshire soldiers, led by James Reed and John Stark, to Charlestown. So these guys pack up, head for the battlefield. Meanwhile, Joseph Warren is nowhere to be found. He had been missing since the night prior with a migraine headache. This was not like him. He was everywhere at once all the time. He was always exhausted from all of his duties, but they were starting to wonder where he was. Back in Charlestown, the artillery captain finally arrives, and he's really late, and they start to realize all of a sudden that they built this whole fort without any holes in it for the cannons, these things called embrasures. Meanwhile, Israel Putnam, for some reason, while the cannonballs are raining down upon their heads, decides that he's going to send a bunch of soldiers out of the redoubt to return the digging tools to Bunker's Hill. The shovels are so precious, they can spare these men. Prescott says to Putnam, you can't send these guys out. They're never going to come back. And Putnam's going, on my honor as a man and as a general, every one of them will return. They did not return. So now they got no holes for the cannons, and these guys have no shovels to dig with, and they're trying to dig with bleeding, cracked hands. They've been up all night. They've got no food and no water, and cannonballs raining down upon them. Luckily, at this point, a guy named Captain Bancroft says, point the cannon at the wall and shoot a hole in it. Oh, great idea. That's what they do. They shoot a couple of holes in their own fort, and now the artillery on the Patriot side is ready to fire. And these guys are absolutely worthless. These guys fired 7 or 8 cannon blasts with no effect. One shot flew 100 yards over General John Burgoyne's head, and he was standing in the north end of Boston at Copp's Hill Burial Ground. So not only did they miss all the ships, they missed the burial ground, the general, and this cannonball hit a house and a tree. All the other ones were buried into the hill. They couldn't hit anything. And what did they do? They decide, we're leaving. So that's what they do. It was around this time that Joseph Warren re-enters the scene. He's wearing his finest clothing. He's carrying a borrowed musket. And he starts walking toward the battlefield. And everybody that sees him goes, what is he doing here? He's a father of 4 kids. What is he doing here? He's a member of the Committee of Safety. What is he doing here? He's a doctor. What is he doing here? He's the center of the rebel spy network in Boston. What is he doing here? Well, Joseph Warren felt compelled to be there because he had just been appointed a major general. As Joseph Warren stormed to the battlefield, the first person he saw was Israel Putnam. Israel Putnam tried to cede command to Joseph Warren, but Warren said, look, my commission has not yet arrived. And what's more, I don't have military experience. It's an honor to be a general, but I will get everyone killed. I will serve under you. Putnam said, okay, head to the redoubt. Prescott is there. Prescott comes upon Joseph Warren. He says, General Warren, thank you for coming. I cede command to you. Joseph Warren says the same thing. No, no, no. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm here to support the cause and fight alongside you. It will be an honor to serve under you. Prescott shakes his head, assigns him a position. All of a sudden, things get very, very quiet in the redoubt because they realize that the barges full of British redcoats are finally starting to leave Boston. It's early afternoon, and one barge comes into sight, and another barge comes into sight, and another, and another. There are 28 barges stuffed with redcoats. The front barges have cannons in them. The rhythmic rowing of the oars is terrifying. The sun is in the sky. The bayonets are glinting in the sun. The brass buttons are shining. The red coats are reflecting in the ripples of the water. It is just a gloriously terrifying image that the guys in the redoubt see as these British barges start landing troops. General Howe has been given the honor of leading the charge to defeat the redoubt. He lands his soldiers. He directs them to Morton's Hill, and they eat lunch in full view of the redoubt. These guys stop to eat their lunch. The original British plan to attack the redoubt was to send some gunships up Mystic River on one side and to send soldiers through Charlestown on the other side to operate like a pincer maneuver to get behind the enemy lines and route them that way. But William Howe gets there and he's eating lunch and the tide changes. So there are no gunships that can get up there. And what this enables the soldiers in the redoubt to do is to keep fortifying their hill and to start building these 3 triangular, like almost foxholes, a little bit downhill from the redoubt called fletches, and to fortify a rail fence that had been there just as a property line. These New Hampshire men, Stark and another guy named Knowlton, they start putting rocks, hay, sticks, anything they can find into this rail fence. And it's not the sturdiest thing in the world, but it's better than nothing. And so, in the time that William Howe was sitting there eating lunch with his troops, the soldiers in the redoubt are fortifying, 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 fortifying. Luckily for the people in the redoubt, Howe's ammunition and Howe's field pieces also were having problems, because when they finally opened up the ammo boxes after rowing them across on a barge, they had the wrong size cannonballs. It's speculated that this was rebel interference back in Boston, that they secretly switched the ammo boxes knowing that this would happen. So William Howe had no choice but to start loading these cannons with grape shot. It's really, really horrible at close range, but at far range it's much less effective. So his field pieces, they can barely push them through the rough terrain, and they can't quite get these grape shot rounds up to the redoubt. So his field pieces are not great. In the meantime, he decides that rather than gunships going around on the Mystic River side, he's going to send the light infantry. So he sends the light infantry around, but Patriot forces have made this very, very rudimentary but effective stone wall, which corrals all of the soldiers into this narrow corridor right on the water's edge, and they are absolutely torn to ribbons by a surprise attack on the other side of the stone wall. That flank is not going to work. William Howe decides he's going to send the column through the town. But there are snipers in the buildings of Charlestown, and they are picking off these redcoats one by one. And so it's such heavy fire that that left wing of the British attack falls back and retreats, and they report to Howe, we can't get through there. There's snipers everywhere. We're not going to make it through the town. William Howe communicates with Admiral Graves of the Navy, who's been having this cannonade for hours now. And Admiral Graves offers to burn Charlestown to the ground. And William Howe thinks this is a brilliant idea. So Graves says, all right, gentlemen, you know those cannonballs we've been heating red hot for hours just in case we needed them? We need them. So they start shooting flaming hot cannonballs into the wooden buildings of Charlestown. They are shooting these things called carcasses, which are hollow cannonballs filled with incendiary devices. And they actually send troops, British troops, into the town to put the town to the torch. A young loyalist describes it as a most awful, grand, and melancholy sight. General Howe realizes that the beach attack is not going to work, through the town is not going to work, and that the only way to take this hill is to go straight up it at the fort. But here is where his valor enters. Because rather than standing back and sending men up there, he gathers his officers, he gathers his soldiers, and he addresses them, and he said that he would not ask one of them to go a step further than where I go myself at your head. And that is a promise that he kept. Now, General John Burgoyne, it's fun to make fun of him, but he was a brilliant writer. And he has an account of seeing the scene at this point in the battle. I'm just going to read it for you. One of the greatest scenes of war that can be conceived. Howe's corps ascending the hill in the face of the entrenchments, and in the arm of the sea our ships and floating batteries cannonading them, straight before us a large and noble town in one great blaze. The church steeples were great pyramids of fire above the rest. Behind us the church steeples covered with spectators. The hills round the country covered with spectators. The enemy all in anxious suspense. The roar of the cannon, mortars and musketry, the crash of churches, ships upon the stocks, and whole streets falling together. And the reflection that perhaps a defeat was a final loss to the British Empire in America. Now, the first advance of the British Redcoats is a fine time to talk about a quote that's always attributed to this battle. Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. People have argued whether or not this phrase was even said at Bunker Hill. One thing I do know is true, is that ammunition was scarce, and the commanders in the redoubt knew it. And so William Prescott himself, before the British advance started, had gone out into the field beyond the redoubt and driven these steel rods into the ground and instructed not to fire until the soldiers had at least passed this point. Other instructions that were definitely given that day was to aim low, because muskets notoriously fire high and you don't want to waste a shot, and aim for the handsomest coats. Officers had fine coats that kept their red dye. Infantrymen, their coats faded in the sun, turned orangey. So if you could get a commander down, that meant the 2 other soldiers would have to carry him off the battlefield. So with 1 musket ball, you could get 3 men off of the field. William Howe begins to advance his troops up the field. They are organized in columns and rows. They are disciplined. They are unceasing. And he is at their head. And as they advance and advance and advance, they come upon the steel rods. And everyone in the redoubt is given the order to fire at the same time. Boom! There is such horrible carnage delivered by that musket fire that the entire first British advance scatters and retreats. William Howe has reorganized his troops. He's told them to have courage, and he started marching up that hill again. And again they advance, columns and rows and columns and rows. Fifers, drums. The discipline of the British Army is one of the chief tools they would use to terrify their enemy. And imagine these farmers in the redoubt who had been up all night digging. No food, no water, no reinforcements, and barely any ammunition. And here comes the second advance. They reach the steel rods. Boom! The redoubt fires again, pouring lead shot into these British redcoats as fast as they can. And once again, the British redcoats are repelled. Despite the begging of Howe's inferior officers not to have another advance, he insists that they're going to take this hill, because Howe realizes in this moment that if they cannot take this hill, they cannot keep this country. And so William Howe instructs every soldier he has left to take off their backpacks, to shed any equipment that they do not need for a bayonet charge. Affix the bayonets to your muskets and run up that hill. No columns, no rows. Run as fast as you can, scream as loudly as you can, and that's exactly what they do. Inside the redoubt was an absolute horror scene. A British officer is quoted as saying, "I cannot pretend to describe the horror of the scene. We tumbled over the dead to get at the living, who were crowding out of the gorge of the redoubt." Oliver Wendell Holmes. "Over heaps, all torn and gory, shall I tell the fearful story, how they surged above the breastwork as a sea breaks over a deck, how driven, yet scarce defeated, our worn-out men retreated, with their powder horns all emptied like the swimmers from a wreck." William Prescott, realizing that the redoubt was lost, ordered a retreat. But there was only one way out. You couldn't see in there, between the musket smoke, the cannon smoke, the burning of Charlestown, and the terror of the final advance of these British soldiers screaming as loudly as they could. There was such confusion in the redoubt, not everybody made it out. Even in this retreat, William Prescott refused to run. There are several accounts of him striding toward the door of the redoubt, parrying bayonet thrusts with his ceremonial sword. After the battle, his coat, his overcoat, his hat had cuts all in them, stab holes, but he himself was uninjured. One of the people that did not make it out of the redoubt was Dr. Joseph Warren. He was one of the last people in. His concern was shepherding people to safety. There was a loyalist girl observing the whole battle that day. She was only 10 years old. Years and years and years later, she wrote a letter to her granddaughter. She said, "I have read many times of the glory of war, but this one battle taught me, however it be painted by poet or novelist, there is nothing but woe and sorrow and shame to be found in the reality." So the British win the Battle of Bunker Hill. But it cost them almost half the people they sent there. 2,200 British soldiers engaged on that hill that day. Henry Clinton's reaction: "A dear-bought victory, another such would have ruined us. General Howe's reaction: the success is too dearly bought. General Gage, in an official report, offers they were not the despicable rabble they were supposed to be. In a private letter, he confesses, "The loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. I wish this cursed place was burned." Now, this battle was so horrific for everyone involved. There are those who posit that the generals were wrong-footed for the rest of the war. There's a wonderful historian named Dr. Alan French. I'd like to quote him. "There are various critical stages in the American Revolution at which the proper action of these three men could have destroyed the Patriot Army and wrecked the rebel cause." And now this is Richard Ketchum. "That each man failed at one or more crucial moments has led some writers to conclude that the battle for Bunker Hill left an indelible mark upon all three, the memory of those grisly slopes affecting their decisions ever afterward." General Gage was returned to London in disgrace. Henry Clinton went on to continually chafe other generals and officers, even in British victories. He successfully brought Charlestown, South Carolina, under siege. He left command to Cornwallis. When Cornwallis surrendered in Yorktown, Clinton returned to London to find out that he was being blamed for Cornwallis's defeat. General John Burgoyne, leading a campaign in Saratoga, forced to surrender in 1777. He was returned as a prisoner to Boston. And as he's being led up, an old woman sitting on a shed says, make way, the general's coming, give him elbow room." How about that coming back to bite you? General Howe resigned in a storm of criticism. So this is what happened with the British side. I want to return once more to Joseph Warren, who fell at Bunker's Hill. 2 months prior was the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre. And as a political stunt, they decided to have a grand ceremony observing the tragedy that it was. And the guest speaker was Joseph Warren. During this oration, yes, it was about the victims of the Boston Massacre and giving them a proper tribute, but it was also an opportunity to beat up on the British government and to call out tyranny as he saw it, and to inspire his fellow Americans to greatness. So this is a quote from his oration that day. "If pacific measures are ineffectual, and it appears that the only way to safety is through fields of blood, I know you would not turn your faces from your foes, but will undauntedly press forward until tyranny is trodden underfoot and you have fixed your adored goddess Liberty on the American throne. On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important question on which rest the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves." Dr. Joseph Warren died in exactly that way. As he was trying to shepherd his fellow soldiers out to safety in the horror that was the redoubt, he was shot facing his enemy square in the cheek and died in a field of blood. It was a battle that was never supposed to happen. Had decisions been made differently, it wouldn't have. But General Gage was in a pressure cooker to make a good decision. Israel Putnam was itching for a fight. Joseph Warren wanted to prove his bravery. And on and on. The personalities involved created this conflict and saw it through to the end. It was a tragic day, but it sparked a glorious revolution that formed this entire country. That is why it's one of my favorite subjects. Thank you for giving me the time and the opportunity to tell you this story. I look forward to telling you many more in the future.